for that great introduction and welcome. It's great to be here. I just came from Phoenix, as I was telling some folks, where I was at the Education Innovation Summit, and there were 2,000 people there, and there's probably more academics in this room than were there. It's an industry ed tech investor summit, and unfortunately, I think what's happening right now is you have those conversations happening on this side of the room, and then the people who actually run the institutions happening on the other side of the room, and unfortunately they're not talking enough to each other. And I hope that the challenge that I lay out today will be that we are going to be starting to talk to each other more about the challenges facing higher education. So before I start, a couple of things that I usually like to tell audiences. First of all, I've never worked on a college campus, so all my experience in higher education comes mostly from the 16 years I've worked at the Chronicle of Higher Education in various roles, including for 4 years as the top editor, which ended back in 2011. I'm not a researcher, I'm a journalist, and as I like to tell people, in journalism, 3 anecdotes make a trend. So if you ever want to know how the New York Times decides on its trend stories, they found 3 people and suddenly it's a trend. So I am not a quantitative researcher as a journalist. I go out there and I talk to the researchers and try to translate their research for more of a lay audience, which I'll be doing a little bit today. And most of all, I come here as an outsider, right? So in some ways, I'm an insider covering higher education for the Chronicle, but College Unbound, glad you're all reading it or may read it, but I really wrote it for parents and students. And after 15, 16 years of covering higher education from the inside, I wanted to turn that lens around a little bit and spent a lot of time with students and parents and employers and college presidents and faculty and others over the last couple of years. And I really wanted to have more of an outsider's perspective from higher education. And thus, I'm a little bit more critical, I think, than I would have been if I really thought of this book for a group of insiders. So if you read the book or are going to read the book, please make sure that you read it with that lens on. And just out of curiosity, how many of you have kids in college or one day maybe go to college? Okay, so a good room. If you've already had kids through college, I'll tell you some more depressing news afterwards about what's going to happen with them. So I first got interested in higher education in 1994 when I spent the summer in Washington, D.C., and I interned at U.S. News and World Report. And part of my job, or actually my whole job that summer, was to spend time with about 12 other interns in the basement of an office building on N Street in Washington, and calling people like you at colleges and universities to verify your data for the annual college rankings. Now, if you've been in higher ed a long time, most of you probably know the history of the U.S. News and World Report rankings, but back then, they were just starting to really catch on as a force, as an influence in higher ed. They had just really started just a couple of years earlier, and in fact, this is the original U.S. News rankings, the first year they did it. That's it. It was a chart. It was one chart, and as you can see, they just did the top 25 colleges and universities. They sent out a survey of people, so they just asked college presidents to rate other institutions. And again, they only did the top 25. When I show this to people, the first thing they notice is, it's fairly bare bones. They also notice, by the way, the tuition prices there on the right, if you can actually see them. One thing that I notice when I look at this is that 8 of the top 25 are public universities. Today, 3 of them are. And I think that the changes, particularly in the U.S. News and World Report rankings, which of course have changed drastically over the years and have included a lot more input measures that are really only the top elite privates that spend a lot of money can compete aggressively on those things, means that we don't have as many public universities in there today. Of course, rankings of all types over the last couple of decades really sparked a prestige race in higher education that was fueled by an ever-increasing a number of students, particularly affluent students and high school graduates, over the last 2 decades. I came across this quote when I was writing the book, and that the prestige is to higher education as profits is to corporations. And as I visited colleges, particularly over the last couple of years, I see this prestige race play out in so many different ways on college campuses. And so in many ways, the last decade, before the housing crash of 2008, was really marked by students going to any college at any cost. And many institutions wanted to look like their peers, a lot more like their peers, or more so, they wanted to look like the institutions that they aspired to be like. A couple of rungs up the ladder, per se, in the U.S. News and World Report ranking. And what's ironic about all this, and the media loves this stuff, of course, particularly the New York Times talking about selective colleges. They just had an article about a week or so ago about how difficult it is to get into some institutions, namely one in this state, just up the road at Stanford, is that most institutions have become less selective, actually, over the last 50 years. So Carolyn Hawksby has done this work where she shows that the national market for higher education, the fact that it's so much easier to communicate now with institutions in New York if you're sitting in California, and of course it's much cheaper to now fly to New York to go to college than it was 50 years ago, means that the market for higher education is now much more national and international, and as a result, colleges and universities have actually become less selective over the last 50 years. And so what you're now seeing is much more competition for students. And we see this playing out every spring, right around this time of year. And last year, and I'm very curious to see what's going to happen this year, last year nearly half of American colleges and universities missed their either enrollment goal or they missed their goal for net tuition revenue. Nearly half of American colleges and universities. And so what that means is you now see this talk of the decline of American higher education, right? The decline of the residential campus. A couple of months ago, Clay Christensen of Harvard Business School, writing in the New York Times, said, in the next 10 or 15 years, 25% of the bottom tier of every college and university in this country will go out of business or merge. 25% of every sector of higher education. And this is a very popular refrain these days. Now, I don't agree with that. I think it's almost impossible in many ways to put a college out of business. And in many cases, I think that these are really central to many of our communities and what we do. But that doesn't mean it can't happen. Just think of all the other industries that didn't think it would happen, and it did, right? Think of sitting in the boardroom of Blockbuster when Netflix came along, right? Or of Borders when Amazon came along, or of Tower Records. I tell people now, audiences who are maybe in college now or high school, and they have no idea what Tower Records is. But think about when being in the boardroom of Tower Records when iTunes came along. So 15 years ago, I sat in rooms very similar to this and heard people at the front, like me, talk about a future in the news industry, my own industry, where people would read newspapers on devices, right? Now, they never imagined a device as small as many of you now carry in your pocket and read newspapers on, or tablet computers, but they thought that people would increasingly read newspapers on the internet in the late 1990s, and most of the newspaper executives and magazine executives and editors in the room would shake their heads and say, never going to happen, right? We're a public trust, everyone will always want to get a newspaper on their front step. How many of you get a newspaper at your front door today? Okay. Now, how many 15 years ago got a newspaper on your front door? Okay. We didn't want to believe it, right? We didn't want to believe it. And I think the same is true for colleges and universities today. Now, I'm not here to say colleges and universities are, going to go out of business like I think Clay Christensen would say if he were here. I'm not here to say that the future is all about online education, because if you're thinking about traditional students and you look at any survey of traditional 18-year-olds, they actually don't want to go to school online. That doesn't mean they don't want any technology, but they don't want to go to school online. And I'm also not here to say that the liberal arts are dead, right? And that it's all about training for jobs of today, because we definitely do not know what the jobs even of 2 days from now are necessarily going to be. But that doesn't mean that higher education is not going to experience significant change in the coming years. And in fact, my belief is that the student market is more divided than ever before, and that the days of thinking about students as traditional or non-traditional and basing them on those demographics are over. And I think that colleges end up serving students in very similar ways because they think of students in those two big buckets of traditional and non-traditional. And I think the future is much more about serving students based on their motivations for going to college. And we really need to reframe the debate about the future of higher education around that. And when we think about the motivations of students going to college, whether they're traditional 18-year-olds or whether they're adults, we see many more reasons about what they want to get, many more reasons about why they go to college, and many more reasons about what they want to get out of higher education. And as a result, I think that this means that colleges and universities can no longer compete by essentially serving students in a very similar way. That was really, over the last 20 years, I think, encouraged by the U.S. News and World Report rankings. And why is that? Well, for one thing, the financial model, the financial foundation of higher education is shifting, and it's no longer sustainable in many ways. So we hear a lot about student debt in this country, but one of the things we don't talk a lot about is institutional debt and how much it has gone up in just the last decade as institutions went on a spending spree to build up new academic programs, to build up new buildings, and so forth. And taking on debt is not a problem. We all do it in our own personal lives, whether it's to buy a house or buy a car or something else. But we all do it thinking that the salary we get is going to keep coming in. And the change now is that 3/4 of American colleges and universities have either flat or declining net tuition revenue. That's the cash on hand that they have after they give out financial aid in order to not only pay this debt off, but also to invest in new programs, invest in new faculty, students, et cetera. At the same time, the students and parents you're serving have less money in order to pay for increasing tuitions at colleges and universities. So back in early 2000s, it took the average American family about less than 25% of their income to pay median tuition in the United States for 4 years of college. And today it takes over 42%. Now some of that is because tuition prices have been increasing, but it's probably pretty hard for you folks in the back to see. But what the real story here is that median income in the United States is flat and declining in many places. We see this almost every day in the news about the decline of the American middle class. These are students that your institutions have served for decades and for the most part have been able to pay a piece of the bill. And increasingly now that's becoming much more difficult as that bill takes up a larger share of their family income. And at the same time, we also think of college and universities as this place that we go to one time in our life, right? So this is what I call in the book the Hollywood version of American higher education, right? The fall football weekends, the neo-Gothic buildings, the campus quads. And I call that the Hollywood version because when you mostly watch television shows and movies, this is how we imagine colleges and universities. In fact, Monsters U, the Pixar movie that came out, I guess it was a year or two ago, when the producers of that film wanted to create a campus, where did they go? They went to Harvard, they went to MIT, and they went to Stanford, right? But the fact of the matter is that only 2 in 10 students today go to traditional residential campuses and graduate in 4 years. You all know this. When I tell people outside of higher ed, they just are shocked that only 2 in 10 students do that. And at the same time, even those students that end up at traditional colleges and universities, it's not always a great fit for them, right? So 1/3 of them now are transferring at least once before they earn a degree, according to the most recent data from the National Student Clearinghouse. 4 in 5 students tell researchers they're not quite sure why they're in college. at this point in their lives, because I think part of the reason is that, at 18, we graduate from high school in the United States, and you could get a job, and not a very good one. You could go to the military, and increasingly that's less of an option for more and more students. You could live with your parents, and most of them want to kick you out at 18, or you could go to college. And so many students end up in college and are not quite sure why they're there, and that's why, a big reason why 400,000 of them drop out of college every year. And even for those who kind of make it through, they end up being the class of 2013, right? Where a lot of them are underemployed in jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree. 9% of them are unemployed at this point, and they're applying for multiple jobs. And even those who make it through are struggling to figure out of how to launch their careers, right? And so there's this widening gap that is emerging between what the workforce needs and what higher education is producing. And I call this the overworked bachelor's degree, right? It used to be, we thought of the bachelor's degree 30 years ago when fewer people needed a higher education to succeed in the economy. We used to think of the bachelor's degree kind of as a broad education, right? And then you would graduate from college, you would go on to either graduate school to get a more detailed education in a specific discipline, or you would go into the workforce and they would actually train you for a job, right? And then, of course, if you didn't go to college, you still could get a solid middle-class job. And then what happened, of course, is that the economy changed. More and more people, a higher education was required for more and more people. And so thus now we have kind of the practical needs of the economy moving in parallel with kind of the academic broad education, the liberal arts education. And oh, by the way, we need to do this in 4 years, right? Because lawmakers and others and parents want you to get through in 4 years. And we want you to have experiential learning. We want you to have internships. You probably need to work while you're going to college. And oh, by the way, many of our high schools are not preparing students for college level work, and so they come in needing remedial education. And we've packed all of that in to today's bachelor's degree. And what's happening now is that students who are coming out are really struggling with this period of their 20s. So this is work that Tony Carnevale at Georgetown University came out recently with in the last couple of months. And what he's found is that over the last 20 years, there's been a shift in the American workforce. So we're living longer, so we're working longer, and thus people in their 20s now, instead of graduating from college and diving right into a career, now spend much of their 20s what he calls learning and earning, moving between jobs and trying to figure out how to get even more education to move into a career. And I told you, for those folks who didn't raise their hand because they have kids in college or before college, I said I would give you one somewhat depressing stat. The average age he's discovered today, the average age for financial independence of today's college graduates is 30. 30. That's the age now where they reach the median income in the United States, and where many of them have started to at least pay off most of their debt, the age of 30. In 1980, it was 25. So in the last couple of decades, it's moved 5 years, and thus we now have a period of young alumni of our colleges and universities who are really struggling, and almost in some ways, this is a lost decade. So how should then we approach, given all these facts, how should we approach a shift in how we think about traditional higher education? So I started to think about this book when I had my second child. So as it was said in the introduction, I have now 2 children. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old at home. And when this 2-year-old was born, I started to think about what life would be like for her and her sister when they went to college at the end of next decade. And of course, I thought about this, which is what most new parents think about, and that's the price of college by the time that they would go to higher education. Of course, we're talking, $100,000 probably for 4 years of a public, and well north of $150,000, $60,000 for a private. But I thought beyond cost, right, and price. I thought how their lives probably would be very different than my life or my wife's life when we were growing up. For one thing, they were going to live a lot longer than my generation or previous generations. And yet, we still think of college as this thing that you go to one time in your life, usually at the age of 18, and you go through it and you're done by the age of 22, even though they were going to be, and we're seeing this already, working much longer throughout the course of their life. And would we still think of it as one physical place you go to at one time in your life? At the same time, they would probably be switching careers multiple times and jobs multiple times throughout their life. But yet at the age of 18, when we send kids off to college, the first question we usually ask them is, okay, where are you going to go to college? And then what's the second question we ask them? What are you going to do? What are you going to major in? Right? Here at the age of 18, we're asking them to pick a career, essentially, even though the workforce is demanding very different things today than in previous generations. I always like to ask students I meet, what problem do you want to solve? Right? Let's stop thinking about majors and careers, and let's start thinking about what problems you want to solve. So the thesis of the book is really that we're moving toward a future where the student, rather than the institution, is at the center of the universe in American higher education, at the center of the ecosystem of American higher education. So I just finished working on a research project that's going to come out in a couple of weeks that looks at student segments. I made reference to this earlier about looking at students instead of traditional, non-traditional, or commuter and residential, or 18-year-old and adult students. We need to start looking at students based on what motivates them to go to higher education. And the results of this survey, in which we looked at about 3,200 students in college right now or considering going to get a bachelor's degree, shows that students have very different motivations, even 18-year-olds, right? There are 18-year-olds who are really focused on a career. There are 18-year-olds who are really focused on the academic experience because they want to go on to graduate school. There are 18-year-olds who are really have no idea what they want to do, and they're the coming-of-age students, right, that in some ways are drifting through college and that most colleges don't do a very good job at serving. And even among adult students, there are very different segments of students, right? There are the students who want to accelerate their career because they have a great job already. And then there are students who, many of whom are unemployed, who are looking to switch careers. So there are very different motivations for going to college. And the assorted segments of these students, we've discovered, are not homogeneous, but yet colleges are largely serving them that way today. So lifelong learning is now moving from rhetoric to reality, right? So we've talked about lifelong learning for ages, for it seems like decades now, and it's now here. It's now here because of the changes in the economy that I was just talking about, because of the changes in student motivation. It's now here. And in fact, students will need to constantly learn and unlearn and relearn everything that they will do as they work longer, as they move through multiple jobs, as they live longer. So this idea of going to college at one time in your life and as one physical place is really going to change in the future. And so the thesis of the book is that we're moving from this one-size-fits-all system, this buffet line that we have at colleges and universities where we kind of sequester students in one place for 4 years, to much more of an a la carte system that allows students to personalize their experiences much more than they're able to do today. This doesn't replace, by the way, the formal curriculum, but it allows students to assemble a curriculum on the side at the same time that they're accessing the formal curriculum that many residential students already access. So this is, I think when people read my book or they hear about innovation in higher ed, they think that what people like me are advocating for is that we kind of throw out everything that we do today. It's not that at all. I actually, as I said earlier, I don't think residential colleges are going to disappear. But what's going to happen is that because of adaptive learning and competency-based learning, because of experiential and research projects and apprenticeships and internships and online classes and hybrid classes, it will allow students to create many more pathways through institutions than they have today. It will allow them to access it at different points throughout their undergraduate career and beyond. And so students are already doing this, and I want to introduce you to three quickly that I talk about in the book. So the first is Jose James, who I met down in Orlando at Valencia College. And he's part of that third of students today who are swirling through higher education. So swirling is a term that's been around in higher education at least since the late 70s, early 80s. And we used to think of students who swirled through higher education as, well, they can't quite figure out what they want to do, or they don't have the money to stay at institutions. Well, increasingly now, parents and students are seeing multiple pathways through college in much more deliberate ways. So almost a quarter of students now at community colleges, for example, come from families making over $100,000 a year. That's today. 5 years ago, that was under 5%. So since the economy really took a downturn, more and more families, more and more affluent families that used to access traditional four-year residential colleges are now starting to see the swirl through higher education in many different ways. We're also seeing students mix course types much more than we think, right? So what's interesting to me is we know that one bad rap on higher ed is that, higher ed is very siloed, right? Departments don't talk to departments, colleges don't talk to colleges. And in some ways, as we've been thinking about innovation in higher ed, the silos reappear, right? There's online education, there's hybrid education, and then there's traditional face-to-face education. And where institutions offer multiple ways of accessing their courses, students really don't think in those terms, right? They move much more seamlessly between course types. So Jennifer Black is a student I met at the University of Central Florida, where 2/3 of their students at the University of Central Florida in any given semester take these are residential students, by the way, living on campus or near campus, take either a hybrid course or an online course. And so she took a quarter of her courses in either online or hybrid format. She still was able to finish her degree in 4 years and work and do all that stuff that I talked about earlier that we have to now stuff into a bachelor's degree. And by the way, the University of Central Florida has estimated they built about 9 fewer classroom buildings as a result of all the students now taking courses in multiple ways. And then, of course, and many of you, I know you've been talking a lot about this, and we'll be talking a lot about this at this conference, is competency-based education. And of all the quote-unquote innovations in higher ed, I think this one has probably the most promise to change the trajectory around costs, because it actually changes the time to degree. And so I met Cheryl Hsu, who's in the book, who is a student at Western Governors University. But of course, as many of you know, we now have a number of traditional universities in the last year, Northern Arizona, University of Wisconsin, Southern New Hampshire, who have launched competency-based programs. And the idea of not basing it on seat time, but basing it on what students know. But it goes beyond this, right? And this is actually something new since the book came out. These are probably names of companies that you may have heard of or may not have heard of, but they all offer education. They all consider themselves educational providers. And what they are really doing is providing what I call just-in-time education, right? So to students who go to these places, they're accessing education no longer requires months and years of planning. It no longer requires countless applications or tapping out savings or requiring students to take out huge amounts of loans or giving up weeks or months of your life to go on a schedule that some university demands of you. It allows you to tap education at any point in your life. And this is a fairly new, many of these companies are even new since the book came out, but one of them I mentioned in the book was General Assembly. How many of you have heard of General Assembly? Okay, a couple people. So General Assembly is now in 9 cities. It offers courses anywhere from a couple of hours to 10 or 11 weeks. They opened up in Washington, D.C. last summer, and I went down to visit there a couple of weeks ago. They're selling out of almost every course that they offer, mostly skills-based courses, right? So they have no intention of competing on the liberal arts or competing in a very traditional, education way, but they want to provide just-in-time skills training for students who may need it to get a job. But get this. First of all, they're selling out of almost every single course they're offering in DC. But the average age of the student is 25, and 99% of them have a bachelor's degree. 99% have a bachelor's degree. This, to me, is an area where I think universities need to compete in many more in new ways, right? So these are your students just a couple of years out who obviously need additional education. This idea of, we say goodbye to them at commencement, and then that's it, right? Why can't we have university for life? And why can't it be provided by the college or university where I just spent 4 years of my life? Because these institutions are now coming and providing that education for these students who need it, and particularly those students in their 20s who are really struggling to launch. So how can your institutions compete in this new era? So I came across this quote when I was writing the book, because there's obviously been huge changes in the publishing industry also over the last couple of years, and this idea of where the writer and the reader now we can access each other directly. So let's think about that in terms of higher education, where the only really necessary people are the teacher and the student, and everyone who stands between them, your institutions, has both risk and opportunity. And the question is, what should the role of your universities be in the 21st century, where students are accessing higher education in many different ways, and where they're going to access education throughout their lifetime? So this is MR University, and I think this is a good example because many people think of MOOCs, but MR University is out of Virginia. The guy there on the right is Tyler Cowen, who's a behavioral economist at George Mason University, and writes a very popular blog called Marginal Revolution. And a couple of years ago, when the MOOCs were really taken off, and George Mason wasn't really participating, he decided, you know what, I have hundreds of thousands of people reading my blog every month. Why don't I just put up my courses online and call myself a university, which is what he did. So he went home one night and using a $5 app on his iPad, he recorded his lectures along with the person who teaches one of the courses with him, and he put up all these materials online and called himself a university. Now it's free, obviously he doesn't give out credit, but now he is reaching hundreds and thousands of people around the world with his content while he still teaches at George Mason. In many ways, I think this is a fantastic time if you're a student and you want to access information that it used to be you needed to go to the institution down the street, you needed to wait a year or 6 months in order to be accepted to it, and now you could turn on your computer, turn on your iPhone and watch a lecture from some of the best professors around the world, or you could access his lectures. And for professors who want to reach hundreds and thousands of people with their material, also a way now of doing this. So what role then is there for institutions in the future? So A.G. Lafley is the CEO of Procter & Gamble, who's a huge fan, by the way, of liberal arts colleges. He graduated from Hamilton College in upstate New York. But P&G for decades has been in the commodity business, right? They produce everything we use every day, everything from Crest toothpaste to Tide, laundry detergent to Pampers diapers. And what he was finding was that back in the 1990s and the following decade, everybody was getting into that business, right? So now instead of a couple of people who produce toothpaste, now we have 10 different brands, and they were able to drive down prices. So these were truly commodity products. And he wanted to figure out how to revolutionize what they were doing. And he told his folks, we need to think about what is a commodity and what is truly innovative about what we're doing. And I think that's what colleges and universities need to do now too. They need to figure out what is truly differentiating about their institutions, and really double down on those things and decide, you know what? The Econ 101 we teach to a couple hundred students in a lecture hall using a very similar syllabus to the 5 other courses that are taught among our peer institutions, much more of a commodity today when anyone can access that online. And so when I was writing the book, every single person that I talked to who had graduated from college, I asked this question. I asked them, what is the thing you remember most about your residential experience? What is the one thing that you believe still stays with you today, whether you're in your 20s or your 30s or 40s, and what can't easily be replicated online? In other words, what is less of a commodity and what is really differentiating about the institution that you went to? Now, some of them told me things I can't repeat in mixed company, but many of them had experiences that I put in the following 4 buckets. There's no secret here, by the way, right? This is stuff that the folks at Indiana University, and I know you have Carol Schneider talking here later this week. This is exactly what we know as the high impact practices that really, to me, show the value of a traditional residential or a traditional college. And one of them is faculty as mentors. And what's interesting to me is that as we've been trying to cut costs in higher ed, we've been moving much more away from obviously a full-time faculty model and it's nothing against adjuncts, but where adjuncts can't spend as much time mentoring students in a way that they used to. Undergraduate research, everybody I know does undergraduate research. And when I was editor of the Chronicle, I used to get a press release a day about some undergraduate research project. But the institutions that I was most impressed with in the book are those institutions that really bake this into the undergraduate experience from day one, and it's really built into their DNA, right? It's something that they're doing from day one through the capstone experience, because this is not an experience that only seniors should have access to, or only juniors. And in fact, many of the students that I interview in the book, including the woman who is in the lead of the introduction, and those students who dropped out, one of the things they continually said is they didn't quite see a connection between what they were learning in the classroom and what was happening in their real lives. And undergraduate research, and this is something I heard from employers over and over again, they didn't say the words undergraduate research, but the tenets of undergraduate research they really value, right? The idea of not knowing the solution to a problem before you go into it, right? The idea of working in teams, the idea of failing and learning from those failures. All are elements of undergraduate research. The cross-cultural experience, I think, is very critical in a day and age when many students are on social networks and tend to friend people or link in with people who agree with them, who look like them, that the residential campus is really one of the last places that really brings students together from multiple backgrounds and from multiple experiences and put them in one place together. And yet again, I think, and I point this out in the book, that a lot of the trends over the last 20 years on residential campuses have actually started to separate those students out again into groups of students that are in similar majors and so forth. And then finally, this idea of being creative, taking risks, and learning from failure. I heard this a lot from older people who look back on their undergraduate experience as a time when they experimented in a lot of ways, but really found themselves. That was that coming of age experience, and that it was in some ways a safe space for them to fail, and how that has really helped them now later on in their careers. So I want to end on talking about value, and then want to talk about how traditional colleges can compete a little bit more, and then I'll open it up for questions. Because I think the defining piece of higher education in the next 10 years will be around proving your value to the American public that is increasingly skeptical about the higher education and the college degree. So this question has been asked of people in various surveys, right? So Time Magazine, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Gallup, the Carnegie Foundation, a number of places have asked this question or one similar to it. And it asked parents, presidents, and faculty to rate the value for the money spent. So parents who had kids in college, presidents, they had to rate the value of their own institution, and faculty had to rate the value of their own institution that they were teaching at. So these are the percentages of people rating it good or excellent. 40% of the public, and that's dropping. It's not, by the way, that Americans don't think higher education is valuable. In fact, if you look at any survey, 90+% of them want to send their kids to college. And a lot of them are saving for that, but they're increasingly skeptical about the value they're getting in return for that tuition check they're sending in. Presidents, 76% of them think we're doing a terrific job. This is what I call the value gap in American higher education, because the presidents think they're doing a terrific job and the public doesn't. So it used to be I only had these two data points. And in fact, I only talk about these two data points in the book. But since then, a couple of surveys, one in particular by the Chronicle, of 1,400 faculty members asked them the same question. Now, I thought the faculty, by the way, would be closer to presidents. Actually, they're closer to the public. The faculty of your institutions are increasingly questioning the value of what's provided. What's behind that? I don't know. I think we need more research on this. I think part of it is an entire chapter I dedicated into the book of student as consumer, where there's many more demands on faculty members to essentially push students through as quickly as possible and water down courses and the curriculum overall. I think that's part of what's coming out in that thing. So how do we prove value, right? So this is pages from LinkedIn. How many of you are familiar with the LinkedIn university pages? Okay, a lot. That's good. So I went to LinkedIn a couple of months ago because I was very curious about what they were doing around this. So as many of you know, you can now go on LinkedIn, you can click on a university, and you could even pick a particular year, and you can see what those students are, graduates of those universities, or that university who are members of LinkedIn, are doing, right? Where they live, what careers they hold, what they're skilled at, et cetera, et cetera. So I went to LinkedIn a couple of months ago because I was very curious about what they were doing with this. And at the time, LinkedIn moved their age of entry down to 15. So they did this last fall. So now you could be in middle school and join LinkedIn. And their idea is to get people as early as 15 to start their profile, right? And they can put on, if they're in a play or they do some sort of oral presentation, they could put that on their profile, and eventually that could become part of the college application by the time they're seniors. And then they want to put all these other assets that students have onto their LinkedIn profile. I could imagine a day, as they were describing their plans for this, I could imagine a day where this becomes the new rankings, right? And that one that's based on outputs instead of mostly inputs, as I showed you earlier about U.S. News, that LinkedIn could become the next U.S. News and World Report. This is, and it's not only them, right? We know the Obama administration's thinking about a new rating system. And when that came out, when details of that came out a couple months ago, I met Bob Morris, who I interned with at U.S. News and World Report, who still runs the rankings. I met him in Washington, and I said, well, what do you think of the new Obama ratings? I said, I don't think they're really going to go anywhere. And he said, I agree, but it doesn't matter, because if he asks colleges, if the administration asks colleges to collect this data, we will be able to take it and incorporate it into our rankings, thus changing the rankings. So my challenge, I think, to colleges and universities is that if you don't define the value for the next generation of students and parents, others, LinkedIn, U.S. News and World Report, the Obama administration will do it. They will do it for you. And to me, this is the grand challenge of the next decade in higher education, is to figure out all that data you have that you have to collect for everybody else, including WASC, to use that data in ways, in new and different ways, to prove your value to American students and parents. So I want to end on how to compete in this new world that I just described. Proving value, I think, is incredibly important. Visualizing the learning outcomes. So this is really what, in some ways, I think LinkedIn is moving toward, right? The more stuff that you can add to that profile, you can start to now visualize skill sets that students have. So it's not just where they went to school and what degree they got and what job they have, but now here are the skills that people are endorsing them for, right? And so eventually, I think where they're headed, they haven't said this, but where I think they're headed, is that if you want to become vice president for marketing at a company, you could go on LinkedIn and you could see everybody who holds that job today at Fortune 500 companies, and you could trace them back and find out the 50 colleges they probably went to and the jobs they held before they held that job and the skills they're endorsed for. So why can't we visualize what our students are doing as well? Certifying experiences. So this idea that students might swirl a lot more in the future, at the end of the day, we know that a bachelor's degree is more than just a random collection of 120 credits. So somebody at the end of the day has to certify what a student did, even if they didn't just do it on your campus. They have to certify what your students are doing at multiple campuses, and I think there's a role for colleges and universities to do that. Redesigning the transition points to college and from college. So stop thinking of college as just that 4-year physical experience, and think about what's happening before college and after college, particularly, by the way, for those students in their 20s who are really struggling today and are going and accessing education and paying, by the way, a lot of money in some cases, a lot of money after they just paid all your institutions a lot of money, to access things like Skillshare and General Assembly and all those others. Why can't you be providing some of that? And then finally, and maybe you can't do this all alone, is developing much deeper alliances with other institutions in order to do this. I actually don't think, as I said earlier, a lot of institutions will go out of business. We might see some mergers, but I hope to see a lot more deeper alliances. And I'm not talking back office operations, right? I'm talking much deeper alliances between the academic sides of the university. So many of you who've been around for a while in higher education are probably saying, oh, I've heard all this before. Every decade somebody says higher education is going to change as we know it, and you know what? Doesn't happen, right? In fact, 1976, Newsweek basically says we have too many college graduates, so who needs college? Well, Newsweek is no longer in business, but we have actually more colleges and universities today than we did in 1976 when they predicted this. And I think this gives American college leaders a lot of confidence that, you know what, we're just going to get through the next couple of years and we'll get through it. One of the things that I have come to realize in reporting this book is that we tend to overestimate the speed of change, right? We always think, oh, something's going to happen by next year, and it actually takes 5 or 6 years. But we tend to underestimate the depth of change. And so we could be here in 10 years, and really higher education has changed in many more drastic ways than we even think of today. I think there's a lot of challenges for you. I think, though, that the future of higher education is incredibly bright because the enterprise is really strong, right? More and more people around the world want higher education. It's the industry that serves those students in the U.S., I think, that is challenged today, and where I think you need to shift your thinking for a future where students are going to demand many different things from the types of institutions that you're serving today. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the questions.